The air is thick with smoke covering the atmosphere, and flames devour homes, turning the night sky to a furious shade of orange. Black families run for their lives, their cries being swallowed by the chaos of gunfire. Bullets fly through the darkness as armed mobs invade the streets. A father shields his children behind him, and his voice shakes as he whispers, "Run! Don't look back." His wife clutches their youngest child. Tears continuously flow down her face as they vanish into the woods, their footsteps muffled by the dry leaves beneath them. Just a couple hours before then, this city was a thriving black community that was doing well for themselves. Now, it has become a war zone. The streets of Ocoee, Florida, are stained with the blood of its black residents. This is not a scene from a distant war or action movie. This is America. Election night, 1920. But unlike most elections, the ballots cast on this day did not look anything close to democracy. Rather, it was an event where terror was unleashed. What happened that fateful night was not a riot. It was a bloody massacre. Yet for many decades, the Ocoee Massacre was erased from the narratives of history, buried deep beneath layers of lies, silence, and stolen land. No arrests were made, no justice was served, and an entire black community was wiped off the map, simply because they dared to exercise their right to vote. Think about this for a moment. Why don't we learn about this in school? Why do history books gloss over the fact that Ocoee, which was once home to prosperous black families, was turned into a whites-only town after that bloody night? Why does this story remain hidden, while the perpetrators walked free and thrived on the land they stole? This isn't just a story about the past. It's a warning, one that ought not to be overlooked, because Ocoee wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a meticulous, systematic effort to erase black political power in America. In this video, we'll expose the truth you've never heard of, the horrors of that fateful night, the heroes who fought back, and the dark forces that sought to silence them. Subscribe to this channel and let's trace the connections between the Ocoee Massacre and the relentless fight for black voting rights that continues to this day. Because this is more than history. This is America's unfinished business. This is the story of how black citizens were massacred, their land stolen, and their history erased, all because they tried to exercise their right to vote. And if we don't learn from it, we are doomed to repeat it. This is the Ocoee 1920 Massacre. To truly understand what happened in Ocoee, we must first journey back and explore the world black Americans lived in during the early 20th century. If you have subscribed, let's get into it. If you haven't, now's the time. 1877, the promise of Reconstruction. This was a period that was meant to uplift newly freed black Americans. Before their eyes, it began to crumble. Black men who were once enslaved had seized the opportunity to build lives of their own. They voted, ran for office, started businesses, and established thriving black communities across the South. But freedom came with a price that white supremacists were determined to make them pay by any means possible. By the end of Reconstruction, white lawmakers and violent mobs struck back with vengeance. They rewrote laws, rigged elections, and terrorized black communities, all to restore the racial hierarchy that slavery once upheld. Across the South, Jim Crow laws were born. These weren't just random rules. They were calculated, systematic barriers that were designed to strip black people of their newly gained rights. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all of them were engineered to make sure that black citizens, especially those who once held political power, could never vote again. But voter suppression was only one piece of the plan. For those who dared to resist, there was another strategy: violence. Lynchings became a public spectacle, a warning to any black person who dared to oppose them. Between 1882 and 1968, over 4,000 black men, women, and children were lynched in America. What were their crimes? Daring to vote, owning land, standing up to white supremacy. The message was clear: stay in your place or die. Florida, which was often perceived as a sunny paradise, was one of the most dangerous places for black Americans. By the early 1900s, the state had one of the highest rates of lynchings in the whole country. And when it came to voting, Florida didn't just suppress black voters. It completely erased them. In 1889, Florida's white lawmakers passed the so-called 8-box law. At first glance, it seemed like a small change in voting procedures. But in reality, it was a trap. Ballots had to be placed in 8 different boxes, each labeled for a specific office. If a voter put their ballot in the wrong box, even by accident, it wouldn't be counted. Who was the target of this law? Black voters were often given little education under Jim Crow, and if that wasn't enough, violence ensured that black citizens stayed away from the polls. By the early 1900s, the Ku Klux Klan had resurged across the country, and Florida was no exception. Klan members didn't just burn crosses. They beat, kidnapped, and murdered black citizens who attempted to vote. Election officials and law enforcement kept blind eyes on their actions. And for many black Floridians, casting a ballot was like signing their death warrant. But despite the danger, black Americans in Florida refused to be silenced. And in Ocoee, a small but thriving black community, they were determined to exercise their right to vote. Ocoee in the early 1900s wasn't just another small town. It was home to a growing black middle class. Black families owned farms, businesses, and land. Some were wealthy landowners who were respected for their hard work, and with success came power. By 1920, Ocoee's black residents were preparing to do something many of them had never done before: vote in a presidential election. For them, this was more than just a political duty. This was a statement that said, "We exist, we matter, and we refuse to be erased." But white supremacists in Florida had other plans. They knew that if black citizens could vote freely, they would gain even more power, more representation, more rights, and more land. And for those who believed in white dominance, that was unacceptable. So, as the 1920 election drew near, tensions in Ocoee became too extreme. The Klan issued warnings. Threats were whispered in the streets. Negroes who vote will face consequences. And yet, despite the fear, despite the danger, Ocoee's black residents stood their ground. They did not back down. They would vote. And in doing so, they unknowingly sealed their fate. With tensions rising, Election Day 1920 became a turning point in Ocoee's history, a day that would start with hope and end in blood. Ocoee, Florida, a town of opportunities. For black residents in the early 1900s, Ocoee was more than just another southern town. It was a symbol of black prosperity. Black families weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Among them were 2 men who embodied this spirit of progress: Mose Norman and July Perry. Mose Norman was a self-made businessman and a proud black landowner. He had money, he had influence, and above all, he had a deep belief in the power of the vote. July Perry, his close friend and fellow landowner, shared the same belief. He wasn't just respected in Ocoee, he was admired, a successful farmer, a devoted husband, and a leader in the black community. But to white supremacists, Perry and Norman were dangerous, because in their eyes, a black man with land was a threat. A black man who encouraged others to vote? That was an act of war. By 1920, Florida's black population was growing rapidly. For decades, Jim Crow laws had robbed them of their right to vote. But this election, the presidential election of 1920, felt different. Across Florida, black leaders were mobilizing. They encouraged their people to fight back against voter suppression. And in Ocoee, Mose Norman and July Perry led that charge. They organized meetings. They educated black voters on their rights. They urged them to stand their ground, no matter what. But not everyone wanted to see black citizens rise. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been growing in strength across Florida, had a message for Ocoee's black residents. A message written in fire and blood: do not vote or suffer the consequences. In the weeks leading up to the election, Klan members marched through the streets of Florida, draped in white hoods, torches in their hands. They posted warnings in black neighborhoods. They whispered threats. Anyone who tried to vote would pay with their life. But in Ocoee, black citizens refused to back down. For Mose Norman, July Perry, and so many others, voting wasn't just a civil right. It was a duty. And no threat, no law, no intimidation could stop them. November 2nd, 1920. Election Day arrived like any other day in Ocoee. But beneath the surface, tension was waiting to burst. White poll workers sat behind their desks, watching as the first black citizens approached the voting station. These men had been warned, and now it was time to make good on those threats. One by one, black voters were turned away. Some were told they hadn't paid their poll tax, others were told they weren't on the registration list. No matter what excuse they used, the message was the same: you will not vote today. Then came Mose Norman. He wasn't just any voter, he was a man of influence, a man of means, a man who knew his rights, and he would not be turned away so easily. As he approached the voting station, he carried himself with undiluted confidence. When the white poll workers denied him his ballot, he didn't lower his head. He didn't back down. Instead, he demanded answers. "Have paid my poll tax. I am a registered voter, and I have the right to cast my ballot." The white men at the station were stunned. A black man standing in front of them demanding his rights? The tension in the room grew thick, and the air became electrifying with danger. And then, someone called for the sheriff. Mose Norman knew what that meant. It was no longer about voting, it was about survival. Norman turned and rushed out of the polling station, vanishing into the streets of Ocoee. He knew what would happen next, and his instinct was right. News of the incident spread like wildfire. A black man had challenged the system. A black man had dared to demand his rights. By nightfall, rage consumed the white population of Ocoee. A mob of armed men gathered. Sheriff deputies, white townspeople, and Klansmen, all united by a single purpose: to teach black Ocoee a lesson that would never be forgotten in a hurry. To send a message so violent, so devastating, that no black citizen in Florida would ever dare to vote again. And so they set their sights on July Perry's house, because if they were going to make an example of someone, it would be him. What followed was not just a massacre, it was a terrible act of terror. A campaign of ethnic cleansing that left an entire black community erased from history. And in the dead of night, Ocoee burned. The election night in Ocoee, November 2nd, 1920. The air was thick. Tensions had been simmering for weeks, but now they had found a reason to explode. A mob of furious white men, many of them local law enforcement, landowners, and Ku Klux Klan members, descended upon the home of Mose Norman. Why? Because he dared to vote. While Norman had been turned away from the pool to cast his ballot, the white election officials had made it clear no black man would be voting in Ocoee that day. But Mose Norman refused to be silenced. He knew his rights, he fought back. That was when the mob came for him. They stormed his house, demanding he come out. But by then, Mose Norman had disappeared into the night, running with his life. So instead, the mob turned their fury toward another target. Just a few streets away, another black man had taken a stand, July Perry. That was when that started targeting him. Perry was a respected farmer. He had encouraged his fellow black neighbors to vote that day, just as he had done many times before. But now white rage was knocking at his door. The mob surrounded his home. Inside was July Perry and his family. His wife and daughter, trembling in fear, knew they had little time. But July Perry wasn't the type who would run. He quickly grabbed his rifle, and when the mob kicked down his door, he pulled the trigger in their direction. Immediately, 2 white men fell. The mob, being shocked, pulled back. July Perry had wounded them, but it wasn't enough to stop what was coming. The crowd outside had grown to 100. Some say nearly 500 armed white men, many fresh from a Klan rally in Orlando the night before. And they were out for blood. They forced their way into Perry's house. Perry, being overwhelmed and outnumbered, the black young man was shot down. He was dragged from his home bleeding, his screams echoing through the night. His family helplessly watched in horror. They hauled him to the Orange County Jail, but the mob had no intention of letting him live. July Perry was lynched, and his body was left hanging from a telephone to pass a message to every black citizen in Ocoee. Leave or suffer the same fate. The bloodshed didn't stop with July Perry, it had only just begun. After his lynching, the mob turned to the rest of Ocoee's black population. Homes were set ablaze, businesses torched down, and churches were destroyed. White rioters hunted down black families, shooting men in the streets, dragging women from their homes, and burning everything in their path. Children ran for their lives, only to watch their parents being gunned down before their eyes. For some, there was no escape. Black residents were incinerated alive, being trapped inside their own burning homes. Those who tried to flee into the woods were shot in the back. Their bodies were dumped in mass graves. How many died that night? Some reports claimed around 30, but survivors say a different story. They say at least 60, maybe more. Some whisper that hundreds were slaughtered, and the worst part? The world never even noticed. Newspapers barely covered it. Authorities erased it from history. The black residents of Ocoee had done nothing wrong. They simply wanted to vote. But for that crime, their entire community was wiped off the map. By sunrise, Ocoee had become a ghost town. The black residents who survived had two choices: run or die. Fathers grabbed their children, mothers clutched their babies, fleeing in the dead of night, never to return. Some made it to Orlando. Others kept running, heading north, west, anywhere but here. Those who owned land, homes, and businesses lost everything overnight, because after they fled, white mobs seized their property. What had been a thriving black community was now white-owned overnight. And the worst part was, the law protected the murderers. Not even a single person was arrested. Not a single person was held accountable. Instead, the city of Ocoee rephrased its history. For decades after the massacre, not a single black person lived in Ocoee. It became known as a sundown town, a place where black people were warned, don't be caught here after dark. For nearly a century, black Ocoee was erased. No memorials, no justice, no acknowledgement. And as for the white perpetrators, they didn't just get away with murder. They took everything these black families had built. The Ocoee Massacre wasn't an accident. It was a warning. A calculated, brutal message that was meant to terrify black Americans across the country. And guess what? It worked. For decades, black citizens became afraid of voting, not just in Florida, but everywhere. But even as white society buried the truth, the survivors never forgot. Their stories, their pain, and their losses all passed down from generation to generation. And now, after a century of silence, the truth is finally coming to light. Because history can only be buried for so long. The morning light revealed the true horror of what had happened in Ocoee. Black neighborhoods that were once filled with life, laughter, and progress now lay in ruins. Homes, churches, and businesses were burnt and demolished to smoldering ash. The bodies of murdered black residents, fathers, mothers, and children, were either left in the streets, burned, or hurriedly disposed of in unmarked graves. Those who survived the attack had already fled. They left behind everything: homes, businesses, farmland, and memories, never to return. But as the smoke settled, a new battle began. Not with guns or torches, but with lies, silence, and stolen history. A couple of days after the massacre, local newspapers ran the story. But not as an attack, not as a mass killing, not as an atrocity. Instead, they framed it as a race riot. The newspaper didn't tell the truth. They put up false headings like, "Negro Uprising Quelled in Ocoee." Black aggressors met with force. White citizens defend their homes from Negro mob. They didn't mention the planned voter suppression. They didn't mention the Klan's threats. They didn't mention the mobs that hunted down black families like animals. Instead, they painted black residents as the aggressors and offenders, even though it was their homes that had been burned, even though it was their families that had been slaughtered, even though it was their entire community that had been wiped off the map. In the eyes of white society, they were the criminals. And white Ocoee? They were framed as the heroes. You would think that after such a violent, large-scale massacre, there would be an investigation, arrests, trials, or some form of justice strategy. But surprisingly, there was none. Not a single white rioter was arrested. Not a single white supremacist was held accountable. Not a single person was charged for mass murder. The legal system, the police, the local government, all of them turned a blind eye. They did more than that. They made sure the victims could never return home. Once the black families of Ocoee had fled for their lives, their homes, farms, and businesses were left and abandoned. But they wouldn't stay empty for long. White residents swooped in and claimed everything. Land that had been bought and built by black families was stolen overnight. Black farmers who had worked their land for generations, only for it to vanish. Property deeds were signed over to white hands, sometimes without any paperwork at all. And here's the coldest part. Many of the black families still owed mortgages and taxes on that land. But instead of being allowed to return, the government declared their properties abandoned. White buyers, many of whom had taken part in the massacre, bought the stolen land for a small amount. And if any black survivor tried to return, they were met with violence and death threats. This wasn't just murder. This wasn't just destruction. This was an economic warfare. The survivors of Ocoee carried more than just the scars of that night. They carried a lifetime of fear. Many of them never spoke about the massacre again. Not to their children, not to their grandchildren, not to anyone. Because they knew the truth. Talking about Ocoee could get them killed. So the memory of that night became a secret, a painful hidden wound passed down from generation to generation. For decades, black families who once called Ocoee home never dared to return. And their children? Many grew up never knowing that their parents had once owned land there. Land that had been stolen. Land that, to this day, still sits in white hands. For about a century, the Ocoee Massacre was erased from history. There were no memorials, no history books mention the atrocity, and no public acknowledgement of what had happened on that fateful day in 1920. In Florida schools, students learned about the American Revolution, the Civil War, and World War I, but Ocoee, nowhere to be found. Even Florida's state records made no real mention of what had taken place. The goal was simple: erase the crime, erase the victims, erase Black Ocoee from existence, and for generations it worked. But the truth cannot be buried forever. Decades passed. The survivors aged and died. But the truth, it refused to stay hidden. Because as much as history tried to forget the Ocoee Massacre, there were still those who remembered, and in time, the fight for justice has just begun. For those who survived, silence was not a choice, it was a necessity. Survivors feared for their lives. If they spoke of what happened, they knew they could face the same fate as those who had been murdered. For decades, Ocoee's black survivors scattered across the country. Some were forced into exile. Some rebuilt their lives in neighboring towns. Others moved far away, never uttering a word about the horror they had witnessed. For many, the trauma was too great. Parents did not tell their children. Grandparents whispered warnings but left out details of what exactly happened, not just to protect themselves but to shield the next generation from the weight of their pain. Meanwhile, Ocoee's white residents kept their silence for another reason. They had everything to lose if the truth eventually came out. The land, the stolen wealth, the illusion of peace in their town, it was all built on bloodshed. And so, for generations, the Ocoee Massacre was buried under the weight of silence, fear, and whitewashed history. But history has a way of resurfacing. By the 1980s and 1990s, a new generation of historians, activists, and journalists began to ask questions. Why were there no black residents in Ocoee for decades? Why did land records show sudden transfers of black-owned property in the aftermath of the 1920 election? What happened that night? One of the first people to publicly speak on the massacre was Julian Chambliss, who was a historian who began to dig into Ocoee's past. He, along with journalists and local researchers, began to put pieces together to picture what had truly happened, a picture that many white residents still refused to acknowledge. Then came the turning point. In 1999, the Orlando Sentinel published a detailed report on the Ocoee Massacre. For the first time in decades, the silence was broken. Florida's black community demanded answers. White residents, many of whom had benefited from stolen black land, found themselves confronted with a past they could no longer deny. From there, the fight for recognition grew stronger. Activists pushed for historical markers, school curriculums, and official acknowledgement from the state of Florida. And after 100 years of denial, the truth finally began to be recognized. By 2020, exactly 100 years after the massacre, Florida's state government finally took action. A law was passed that required Florida schools to teach the Ocoee Massacre. This law broke a century of deliberate erasure. But while education was a step in the right direction, it was not enough. The deeper question remained, how do you compensate for stolen land, lost wealth, and a century of injustice? Florida lawmakers began to discuss financial reparations. After intense debate, the state approved a $2 million fund for descendants of black Ocoee residents who had been driven from their land. It was the first time in U.S. history that a government had financially compensated black families for a racial massacre. But was it justice? How do you put a price on an entire community that was wiped off the map, on lives stolen, on generational wealth that was lost, not out of carelessness, but hatred and denial? Many black descendants called the reparations a start, but far from enough. Some families were never found. Some records were destroyed. And the land? The land that had been stolen remained in the hands of the whites. However, reparations helped, but they did not undo the damage. Even with recognition, even with reparations, the scars of the Ocoee Massacre remain. Till today, some white families in Ocoee still own land that was once owned by blacks. To this day, some Florida residents refuse to acknowledge that the massacre ever happened. To this day, America still struggles with voter suppression in some parts. Echoes of the very racism that led to the Ocoee Massacre in the first place. But the lesson of Ocoee is clear. Silence allows history to repeat itself. When injustice goes unchecked, it does not fade. It festers. And if we do not confront the past, we risk living it all over again. The Ocoee Massacre was not just a tragedy of the past. It is a reminder that the fight for justice is still ongoing. The question is, will we learn from it, or will we let history repeat itself? While the days of mass racial massacres may be over, voter suppression is far from a thing of the past. The tactics have evolved, but the goal remains the same: to keep black voices out of the political process. From literacy tests and poll taxes in the early 20th century, to modern-day voter ID laws, mass purges of voter rolls, and polling station closures in black communities. If we ignore the Ocoee Massacre, we fail to see the warning signs in our own time. If we forget what happened, we risk repeating history. If we do not teach the Ocoee Massacre, how many more stories like it will remain buried? If we do not remember, how easy will it be for history to be whitewashed once again? American history is black history, and yet there are still people trying to erase it. Book bans, whitewashed school curriculums, laws restricting the teaching of systemic racism. It's happening right now, but we have a choice. We can break the cycle. We can refuse to let another generation grow up in ignorance. We can make sure the names of those lost in Ocoee are never forgotten. This event is one we can no longer afford to ignore. When we allow the powerful to silence the voices of the oppressed, we all lose. When we let fear and hate dictate who gets a seat at the table, we all suffer. And when we erase black history, we are erasing the very foundation of America itself. We must never allow that to happen again. If you've made it this far, you have a responsibility. Here's what you can do. Share this story. The more people who know the truth, the harder it is to erase. Educate yourself. Get involved. Support organizations fighting for voting rights and racial justice. Hold leaders accountable. Push for policies that protect black voters also, and ensure history is taught accurately. Ocoee's story was hidden for over a decade. What other truths are still waiting to be uncovered? And more importantly, what will you do to make sure they are never buried again? Leave your thoughts in the comments.